Aloha and welcome to Meteor, the fourth video, I think, on Meteor Application Template React. The first video was a brief overview of the UI, the second one was data initialization, the third one was going through the pages and how we use React to render the pages and publications and subscriptions. Now we're going to talk about forms, kind of the last major piece of things. So if you have, the system running, right, which at localhost, for example, and we bring up the template, we log in this case as the admin, but it could be as anybody. We have some forms. Here's an add stuff form. Well, let's start off. We have a page that lists the current things in the database, and if we want to add something to the database, we could use a form. And by the way, if we click the submit button with nothing there, we get an error message saying, hey, you have to add some stuff. So what should we add? Let's add cucumbers. I'm growing those in my garden right now, and maybe I got 3 of them, and we could always be optimistic and say that they're going to be excellent cucumbers. So I submit that, and we get this little dialog box that pops up. This is from a package called Sweet Alert, and it says, hey, everything was good. I think the items are now in the database, and so we click OK. And then if we go to the list stuff page, we see, yes, in fact, there are some cucumbers in the database now. And let's say that I, underestimated my harvest. In fact, I got 10 cucumbers. I could go here and I could change the quantity from 3 to 10, press submit. It says, yes, everything's okay. So we say, okay. We go back to list stuff. We see, great, now there's 10 cucumbers. So there's essentially, 2 pages with forms, an add stuff and an edit stuff page, and it's used to, and that's kind of implement or integrated with the backend database so that we can store the information that we submit via our forms. That's not always the case that a form leads to updates to a database, but it's extremely common that that's what's happening. So let's see how we do that. The way we're going to do that in this particular template is by using this external library called uniforms. Okay, so it is possible without an external library, just using kind of vanilla React and hooks and so forth to create forms and submit them. But there's a lot of kind of boilerplate stuff that goes on under the covers. You've got to decide what kind of controller to use. You've got to deal with that validation. So you notice, when I tried to click submit and there weren't any fields, we got those error messages. And then there's just kind of converting between the typing, the text that you type in to a form and the actual object, the actual data that you want submitted. So simple cases, you type in the string 3, you want the number 3 internally to be returned. So there's a lot of kind of housekeeping stuff that's involved with, and then the fourth thing is that each CSS framework has a slightly different way of wrapping the form, the primitive form elements. So HTML has primitive form elements, and then Bootstrap provides its kind of wrapper around those, and then, or styling for them, and then React Bootstrap provides a controller that's wrapped around that, and each library kind of does it in a slightly different way. So if here at the uniforms page, if we go to the playground, we can see that what they've done is to deal with that. They say, okay, we're going to provide uniforms provides a package that takes the Ant CSS framework and provides some uniforms controls that kind of wrap around the various kinds of form controllers that are styled by the Ant package to do the right thing. And then if you can see they have one for Bootstrap 3, 4, and 5, for Material UI, for Semantic, and then they have this kind of primitive one. All right, and we're going to use the package for Uniforms Bootstrap 5, which makes things kind of work correctly in the case of the Bootstrap 5 CSS framework, which is the one that we're using. Okay, so some of you might be saying, oh my God, that's like crazy, like let's just use the regular primitive stuff. And what I will say is that, for a very simple form, Very simple. It's arguable whether or not this adds value, but very quickly, it gets complicated to deal with forms. I kid you not. And at that point, you're going to say, wow, this uniforms thing, it takes a little bit of time to learn, but holy smokes, it's like way less code, and in a sense, code equals effort. So if you got to write 100 lines of code to do it versus, 10 lines of code, even if those 10 lines of code are more complicated or you have to understand more about stuff, it's probably a time saving. I've used this package for a long time, and I do believe that it's a good way to go when you're doing form processing. Okay. What else? Yeah. Okay. So let's go back here, and let's start with the this add stuff page. Okay, right? So we've got this simple form. It's got a name. It's got a numeric quantity. It's got a pull down list, and then we've got a submit field. So let's go look at the code and see how add stuff actually does that. So here's the page. Okay, and first let's kind of look and see what the actual React code looks like. Okay, the actual display code for this page. Well, you see there's a container, there's a row, there's this kind of header at the top, and then there's this thing called autoform, which is a uniforms concept. And the idea with autoform is that you are going to supply inside the autoform element, you're going to supply code that uses whatever CSS framework you're using, plus you will use card from the CSS framework, which is React Bootstrap. And then for the actual form controllers, we're going to use components from the uniforms package for the particular CSS framework that we're using. Okay? So if you look down here, we got a card and a card body that comes from just React Bootstrap. Text field comes from the uniforms package for React Bootstrap. Okay? And so these are all controllers: a text field, a num field, a select field, and a submit field. So if we go here, name field, quantity field, condition field, submit field. So we got those 4 fields in a row, and then we've got this other thing that says, this is the place where we'll put our errors, and there it is. Okay. So that's the first thing, is you're going to use this autoform. And most of the time, autoform is going to be just fine for you, and definitely for starters, and probably for finishers. You'll just use autoform. And so as I said before, inside it, you're going to lay out how you want your form to be displayed. We'll use these fields to say, I want a text field, I want a num field, and I want a select field, and then I provide this name. Okay? All right, so the second idea of uniforms is that when you specify a form, you provide a schema. And the schema is going to tell uniforms how to map whatever the data is to the field, and how to map what's input into the field to the kind of data that you want. Okay? So here's our schema up here. All right, and what we're going to say, and we're going to use this simple schema, and that's really nice because actually that's the schema that we use with MongoDB. So we're going to use the exact same kind of schema that we use to specify the structure of our database, which turns out to be super nice, as you'll see in a second. And when we specify this schema, we're going to say we're going to have a field called name, which will be a string. We have a field called quantity, which will be a number. And we have a field called condition, each element of which is a string, the allowed values of which are these 4 strings, and the default value is this. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Do you notice what we did? We just specified essentially, what would be needed to build a pull-down menu that has a fixed number of possible values and what default value should be displayed. All right. So when we create this auto form, we're going to pass in the schema. Now the thing of it is that uniforms needs a schema that's slightly different, has a little bit of extra functionality beyond simple schema. And in fact, they don't just support simple schema, they support some other schema mechanisms out there as well. So in order to solve that problem, they said, listen, what you do is you create your schema using whatever schema package you like. We don't care. We'll support all of them or most of them. But then once you built your schema, pass it to this one of our predefined functions to get, and they just call it the bridge, so we're going to call it bridge. But it's basically a uniforms enhanced version of the schema that has the extra stuff in it that uniforms needs to do whatever black magic that it's doing. So that's what we actually pass in as our schema. And I don't even know what they do in here, and frankly, I don't care, right? I just think, I define a schema using the language the mechanism that I like. They want me to call this, fine, I do it, and then I pass that in, and then things work the way I want. Okay, the second thing that they want you to do is this onSubmit, okay? And the onSubmit says parameter is a parameter that needs to take a function, and that function is going to be passed an object which contains whatever the user put in to the fields, okay? And then does whatever you want to do. So onSubmit, when the user presses the submit button, uniforms is saying, pass me a function that will handle whatever the user did. Okay, so in our case, we're going to have a function that takes this data object as its parameter, or we're actually just building a function right in here, I should say, which is a function that has one argument, takes the object, and it calls this submit. I'll get to this form ref in a second, and whose first argument is the data. And then what we do is we use this destructuring assignment to get the various fields out of that data object. We find out the owner, and we call the insert method, the Mongo insert method on the stuffs collection to insert that stuff. Then we provide a callback that is passed with nothing in the case that everything was successful, or with the error object, and in the event that it's passed with nothing, then we call this sweet alert to say success. Otherwise, we call sweet alert to say, oh, there was a problem. All right, so that's the basic idea. We're going to use AutoForm and these mechanisms to lay out the fields. People type in data, and when we submit, when they press submit, we call this submit function. Now, it's very interesting and useful to note that in the event that we put a 1 in there and we press submit, we don't call this function here. Okay, we only call this function once validation has been passed. So that's a huge, nice thing about uniforms, is that this submit method knows that the data is going to conform to the schema when it's passed in. We don't have to do a bunch of validity checking as long as we're satisfied with the constraints that are put on the data by this schema, because uniforms is going to take care of making sure that when this function, the submit method gets called, submit function gets called, everything's cool. Okay, so the last thing to note about this form is this ref thing. Okay, so to understand that, what I want to say is I'm going to add what else do I have in my garden? I have some squash. Okay, I'm going to maybe get a couple squashes, and I don't know, they're not looking that good. I'm going to say fair. Okay, so I fill out the form, I press submit, it says successful, and then once I click OK, you'll notice the form has been cleared. Okay, so how does that work? The way that works, and it's unfortunately a little tricky, but basically you have to call a reset method up here. You have to call a reset method on the actual kind of HTML or DOM form object to get those forms cleared. But the form object within the DOM is managed internally by uniforms. Okay, we never see a form object in here. We're dealing with a card, you know, and we have a passive schema and everything's magic, right? You know, so like, what's the deal here? You know, our abstraction is kind of punctured in a way because we're not completely isolated from the need to deal with the internals, because in the event of a successful addition of data, we want to call this reset method to clear out the form, okay? So the way uniforms supports that need of the user to sometimes, not always, so in the event of an error, you know, we're not going to clear the form. We're going to let them try to fix it or, you know, resubmit it or whatever. So only in some cases do we want to call this reset method. So we need access to that that object, okay? And the way uniforms allows us to do that is say, we'll have a ref parameter. The ref parameter is going to hold a function which you can use to basically get access. You know, we'll call this function with the actual form, you know, reference object. Once we've actually built it, we'll call this function, and then what we're doing here is saying, okay, well, let's bind this variable inside our function to whatever that reference is, so that then we can later in this function call submit with that thing, okay? And because of the fact that, you know, we're calling the submit method, we know for sure that the form has been built, which means we know for sure there is a reference, which means we know for sure if uniforms works correctly, that that thing's going to be bound to a value. And so now we got that thing in our submit method, and we can call it to clear the form. So it's like a lot of shenanigans. I'm not going to lie, a lot of shenanigans to clear out that silly form. You know, when the data is submitted successfully. Okay, so that's the add stuff method. Now, if we go to list stuff, okay, we've got another situation, which is we want to edit. So there's two kinds, you know, there's a couple of different situations for forms. One is, you know, new data, fill everything in from scratch. But the other big use of forms is we've got some existing data, we want to modify it in some way, and so we use a form for that. The difference being that in the latter case, we want to actually create the form and then put some values into it before we display it to the user. Okay, and that's exactly what this edit method is going to do. So like we've got our squash, we're going to call the edit method. Okay, so that takes us to the edit page. What you may not have noticed until this moment is that the URL includes this long string, which is actually the ID of the record within Mongo associated with you know, this particular collection, or this particular document, I should say, within the stuffs collection. Okay, so when we call, so let's go back. Okay, so this link right here, you got to kind of look down here. It's going to disappear, but you know, go to the lower left-hand corner with your eyes, and now when I go edit, you can see that link that just appears in the lower left-hand corner includes a doc ID. Okay, so when I click edit, now it appears up here and you can see it, but I just want to make it clear that that was actually in the URL of that edit link in the previous page. How does that work? All right, well, the way that works is that when we call edit, I'm going to back up a bit. In our router, okay, when we call edit stuff, let's go all the way to stuff item, okay? So in stuff item, let's go all the way back to list stuff. All right, in list stuff, remember, we got a table. We're going to map through all of the stuff collections. We're going to call stuff item, all right? When we call stuff item and we call it with the stuff object, we're going to say the name, the quantity, the condition, and then that fourth field is a React link to /edit, and then the ID, the doc ID associated with that document within the collection. Okay, so that's how we found that you know, that doc ID. Now that's how it's listed. That's how we get it to be part of the URL in that list stuff page. Okay, now we click that link. So now we go back through the top level page. We got a new URL, so we're going to go through this code again. This time it says, hey, you're calling the edit. So this is what the page is going to match. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this special colon syntax in React Router to say, I want you to bind a variable called _ID to the value of whatever appears in the URL in this at this position. And then we're going to call edit stuff. Okay? So now let's go to edit stuff to see how this all like works itself out. Okay? So the way it works in edit stuff is that we start rendering the page and look at this first line. Okay? We call this useParams method, which is a hook function. Okay? And it's going to return an object that contains all sorts of information about params, but the one in particular we're interested in, it's going to have a field that we're going to have one field for all of those variables that are defined in our router. Okay, so here we said we want this variable here. Okay, and so we get over here and we say, what was the value of that variable? Okay, and it tells us. Okay, then the next thing we have to do is we use our useTracker hook, which we've seen in a previous episode of the screencast, and we're going to subscribe just like we did before to the user publication. We've got a ready just like before, but here's the difference. This time, instead of returning all of the stuffs, right, we're just going to return the specific document in the collection whose doc ID is this _ID. All right, so there's a field in the collection called _ID. It has a value, and we name this variable in app.jsx _ID so that later on we could be, pretty cool and just use that variable, which is, basically the same as saying _ID _ID, right? They're the same, so we don't have to do that. We can just do this. All right. And the basic hook stuff works. So once the subscribe finishes and the subscription is ready, we get this document, and then we proceed on, and then, all right. So then we have our auto form just like before. We have our bridge, pretty much like before, but this time, show you a difference. It turns out that our bridge, our schema we don't have to define it, before and add stuff, we just defined it straight away. But for edit stuff, it turns out we can use the schema that we defined in stuffs. We can use this. Okay, this is kind of exactly equal to what we want, so we can just kind of reuse it instead of copying the code over to this place. So we're going to provide that schema, okay, after it's passed through the bridge thing. Where's the bridge thing? Okay, pass it through the bridge thing, or pass it, yeah, the bridge thing to get the uniforms version of this schema. We have our onSubmit method, pretty much just like before, except notice we don't have the fref thing because we don't clear the form after doing an edit because maybe we want to change it again afterwards. So we don't have to clear the form out. But then we have this additional thing called model, and all we have to do is pass it this document because, and just think about this for a second, right? This document that's returned needs to conform to a schema. The schema it needs to conform to is this one, okay? Right? This schema that specifies the structure of the documents in the collection is exactly the schema that we want for this form, okay? So therefore, we can just take a document from our collection and pass it in directly as the model, okay? So when you want to pre-fill the fields of a form with data, you provide this parameter model, and you provide an object which conforms to your schema, and then Uniforms knows how to extract data from this document and populate the text field, the num field, the select field, okay, and even the hidden field. All right, so so that's how it works, right? I mean, it's kind of as simple as that. We have a submit, and then once you press submit, we go through the same rigmarole as before. This time we call update rather than add or insert, and we set these fields, and we have a error callback, which takes an error object if one is present, and then either does the success or the failure thing. Okay, so we're almost done. Couple things also to note, and that is you might be asking yourself, this doesn't seem very secure to me. Okay, so like for example, okay, this is all well and good. I happen to let's say somebody emailed me the URL for somebody else's document. Okay, and it turned out to be like that one. Could I just manually type in the doc ID for somebody else's data and display their data and edit it? That would be a huge security error. So let's see. Okay, you can't. All right, and here's why. The reason why is because in this field here, when we subscribe to this publication, okay, what we're getting, here's that subscription, okay, is we're returning only those documents in the collection owned by the current user. All right, so in the edit stuff form, when this subscription is fulfilled, the only data that this client has access to is their own data. All right, so it is the case that if you happen to be the current user and you manually typed in a doc ID for some other data that you actually own, then of course you'll get it. You don't have to go through that list stuff form if you happen to know what the doc ID was, had a good memory or whatever, but it doesn't. You can't just simply type in any other doc ID in the database and somehow have that be retrieved, because on the client side, you simply don't know what the document is associated with any doc IDs except the ones that you own yourselves. So that's kind of cool. Final thing I want to talk about in this is that we are using, in Meteor Application Template React, which is kind of a prototyping based thing, we're using this thing called the insecure package. Okay, so what does this mean? Sounds scary, right? Not particularly scary, but something to be aware of. Okay, when you notice that when we've been updating the database, we call stuffs.collection.update, and add stuff we call stuffs.collection.insert. Well, if you think about that, we're calling insert on the mini Mongo database, the database, the replica of Mongo that runs inside each person's browser. That's what stuffs.collection.insert is actually doing. It's not calling any methods on the actual server side, right? This is an actual method invocation on the mini Mongo database in the browsers, as is this one. What the insecure package does primarily, if not, I'm not sure, it may do some other things as well, but basically what it does is it says, hey, for prototyping purposes, it's very easy and convenient to just update your mini Mongo using kind of Mongo syntax, and then Meteor behind the scenes will say, oh, you've updated your mini Mongo, I will send that update over to the server and update the server as well. And that way, as multiple clients working, they're calling update, all those changes are getting merged into the server, sent out to other people. It all works kind of the way you'd want it to work. And we have this very convenient syntax for doing it on the client side. Once you go into production, this is not the best way to do it from a kind of security point of view. What you really want to do instead is you don't want to update the database in the client side and then just replicate those changes. You'd like to basically send a request to the server and say, I would like you to update the database, but you should make sure this is what you actually want to have happen before you do it and replicate all the changes. And so Meteor provides another mechanism called Meteor methods, and that implements exactly what you want in a production scenario and requires you to write a few, like on the order of 10, 15, 20 more lines of code, plus replace this call with the call to the Meteor method. Okay, so it's not an architectural change at all. It's basically taking single lines of code within your application, your prototype, and then changing it from using a mini Mongo update call to a Meteor method invocation. And then everything else, kind of works the way it is. So we could do that in this class, but I kind of have elected to say, you got enough stuff you're trying to learn right now. This is easier to learn. Let's just do it this way for ICS 314. And then when you go into ICS 414, one of the things you will learn, we have another template called Meteor Application Template React Production, which uses Meteor methods here. Okay. And then you'll learn, it takes, 3-4 hours to kind of get your mind wrapped around Meteor methods. You learn how to do, something that's fully kind of industrial strength. Okay, so just to be aware, that with this particular template, this is great for production, great for prototyping, and that there are a few things you'll want to do for production to, remove things that you don't want to release into the wild or use in a database that's manipulating kind of real data. Okay. So that's how you manipulate forms. Hope you enjoyed that. Aloha.